Now, sequels to great movies often fail to live up to their predecessors. Many simply try to relive the same magic by repeating the process, and I recently did a video covering 10 movies I consider to be failed sequels to iconic movies from the 80s. I'll leave it linked here for you guys to check out later if you missed it, but today I have 10 movies that I consider to be great follow-ups to great movies, sequels that may not have been as good as their predecessors, yet ones that were able to deliver plenty of entertainment on their own to justify their existence. So let's get into it. The Naked Gun from the Files of the Police Squad would charm audiences in 1988, and 3 years later, slapstick comedy legend Leslie Nielsen would reprise his role as Lieutenant Frank Drebin in 1991's The Naked Gun 2.5, The Smell of Fear, a movie that would bring plenty of new laughs, plenty of new characters, and would end up surpassing the box office success of the first. To me, The Naked Gun is one of the best spoof comedies of all time, so coming up with the worthy sequel would be a tall task. One The Naked Gun 2.5 would knock out of the park in my opinion. I still slightly prefer the first movie, but this sequel was without question able to carry right along with all the silly and absurd humor without skipping a beat. This movie just brings you right back into that same cartoon world, and all the familiar characters are back and just blending top-tier absurd humor with precision. Leslie Nielsen is the godfather of slapstick spoof humor to me. I consider him to be the gold standard, and he's just an absolute riot in this movie from start to finish. I think Robert Goulet serves up a great villain. This movie has silly drama, light action, and it's non-stop laughs, and sure, it repeats the formula, but that's pretty much the point in this genre. The Naked Gun 2.5 just brings back all the clever charm that the first script was filled with. I've watched this movie so many times, and when pairing it with the first movie, they really just seem together like one long film. Raiders of the Lost Ark would turn the character of Indiana Jones into an 80s icon. The movie would deliver a crowd-pleasing adventure. It would pull in a ton of cash as well. So 3 years later, Harrison Ford would don the hat and whip once again for Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, a movie that would deliver another great adventure and prove to be a divisive sequel for decades, with some people loving it and others feeling it was a step down. Now, I'm probably one of the few who actually liked the Temple of Doom over Raiders, but as a kid, this was the movie for me, and as an adult, while Raiders is the critically more sounder film, I think the over-the-top, fast-paced insanity of this movie just lures me in every time. Ford's having a great time in the character, and Short Round certainly does make up for Capshaw's shortcomings, and I just really love the mood of this movie. I love the backdrops and the adventures and all the exotic locations. I enjoy how the humor is slightly elevated and just worked into many of the action sequences, and really every sequel is going to try to go bigger and better, and it doesn't always work in Temple of Doom, but to me there is just an added confidence to the plot and the tone of this movie that allows it to go slightly more full throttle. And while it may be a little bit more superficial than Raiders of the Lost Ark, this movie is still my favorite Indiana Jones movie. Now, back in 1986, a little action thriller about a special effects expert being framed for a crime called FX would come and go with little movement on the financial needle, but it was appreciated by fans of the genre, and it would have a great run on the home video market. So 6 years after its release, Brian Brown and Brian Dennehy would prove that two Brians do make a right when they would return to investigate a murder in 1991's FX2. You know, I'm not sure what it is, but it seemed like a lot of sequels were just on heavier cable TV rotation growing up, because I remember seeing this sequel much more than the first. Now, FX2 is not as good as FX. It naturally loses its pop of originality. It does get a little bit too cute with some of the gadgetry, and it does focus on more tried and true, fast-paced plotting, but it still manages to result in a strong sequel that does repeat many of the ingredients, but still shows plenty of effort in bringing new, unique elements to the table that all fit within the special effects theme of this franchise. I love the performances from the Bryans in this movie. They've been elevated to a buddy duo, and while it has been done before, it still manages to work for this underrated sequel that delivers plenty of clever action set pieces and a satisfying finale that just kind of feels like a perfect closing for a movie like this, where special effects and movie making technology can be used like a cross between 007 and MacGyver with a splash of Lethal Weapon to solve a crime. Beverly Hills Cop was a smash hit for Eddie Murphy in 1984 with a blend of action, humor, and character charm that audiences loved. 3 years later, Murphy would return as Axel Foley, the budget would be increased, the action and the humor would be ramped up as well, and Tony Scott would direct, making 1987's Beverly Hills Cop 2 the highest grossing release of the entire franchise and a full-throttle commercial action comedy that still maintains its entertainment value today. The first thing that pops with this sequel is the noticeable style and sleekness in the direction from Tony Scott. It does make this movie feel like a much bigger and grander action flick, and I love the atmosphere this sequel is able to deliver while still actually feeling like it's set in the same world with the same vibe as the first movie. There's just an entertaining balance in Beverly Hills Cop 2 between it being a Tony Scott film and an Eddie Murphy action comedy. Jürgen Prochnow and Brigitte Nielsen as the villains, I think, are nicely cast. Prochnow has a menacing demeanor that's perfect for a movie bad guy, and a sexy 6-foot-tall blonde making taking people out with no hesitation is really just peak 80s action attitude. There's still plenty of Murphy charm and comedic banter between he, Reinhold, and Ashton. The plot of avenging Captain Bogomil is perfect revenge fuel, and with Scott behind the camera, the action feels bigger, more elaborate, and much more intense to make this a very worthy sequel. To me, 1987's Predator is one of the best action movies ever made, with the ultimate ensemble of badasses led by Arnold Schwarzenegger. Usually when the leading star of a film does not return for the sequel, the result is often a huge miss, and while not as legendary as its predecessor, 1990's Predator 2, featuring Danny Glover in a sweltering Los Angeles backdrop, would turn out to be a solid action thriller, even if it fails to hold a torch to the first. Some knock this movie when comparing it to the original, and I think Predator is pretty much a perfect movie that had all the right ingredients in place to make something extraordinary out of a relatively simple concept. So the likelihood of Predator 2 being as good or better was really a 10 million to 1 shot. So trying to compare the two only gets in the way of just appreciating the entertainment value that this movie does have. Now, it's far from as good as the first, but it's still able to bring plenty of unique elements to the table to actually warrant its existence. I mean, even if Predator never existed, Predator 2 would be a solid action sci-fi thriller loaded with gritty action, strong performances, spots of suspense, endless bravado, and a great ensemble cast. I think the LA settings here are a cool playground for all the violence and hunting from the Predator, and I think this movie is a great ride. Plus, the practical effects and makeup work are still in place like the first film, so despite all the years, the cunning Predator still looks better than the partially digital one we just recently got in Prey. Now, I think everybody would agree that Chucky is an icon of the horror genre with his twisted Krueger-esque sense of humor and his murderous gusto. 1988's Child's Play is a strong origin story, and horror films are essentially guaranteed a sequel. 1990's Child's Play 2 would be free of the origin constraints. It would escalate the body count and the intensity to result in a sophomore killing spree from Chucky that I sort of enjoy more than the first. Now, I've always loved this movie. I think it's a great sequel. The first Child's Play is certainly a solid horror flick, but it does have a slower pace, and the origin story kind of gets in the way just a little of the sadistic killing fun. I mean, Child's Play 2 just gives Chucky much more to do, and it's a blast of twisted mayhem and campy horror tension. Chucky really comes into his own in this sequel. He's dropping memorable lines and cementing himself as a comedic contender to Freddy Krueger in the horror genre. And while this movie does navigate through all the genre cliches, it just leans into them nicely, it does them right, and the result to me is just a fast-paced ride of delightful violence. I watched this movie on cable over so many weekends growing up. I love the Toy Factory backdrop. The scenes at the school are fun as well. This sequel gave Chucky ample one-liners, plenty of memorable kills, and it's still my favorite movie in the Chucky franchise. Now, many people would consider 1984's The Terminator as being one of the classic sci-fi action thrillers out there, with Arnold's imposing performance as the relentless T-800 being stuff of legend. 7 years would pass, filmmaking technology would boom, Arnold would become a good robot, and Terminator 2 Judgment Night would be released in 1991, changing the game of cinema. It's really a perfect sequel and a film that, on its own, has stood the test of time as being a cinematic masterpiece. Many would say Terminator 2 is a better film than the first, and I would say it's hard to argue that. However, I also think they both serve their purpose perfectly for their intention. Terminator was a smaller, grittier, darker sci-fi action thriller, and a great one. Terminator 2 is a 4-quadrant commercial blockbuster and a fantastic one as well. This movie is really just a complete cinematic package. The visual effects are still crisp all these years later, and the result is a non-stop ride of action spectacle. Arnold plays the good guy this round, and his performance here is easily one of his most iconic. This film would just command the box offices. Audiences loved it, and it was because it was able to take that concept of the first and use it as a great seed for thought-provoking world building that can easily sweep you up. This is one of those movies I can remember watching and coming out of the theater and all of us just being in awe of what we just watched. And even if you've seen it a bunch of times, that feeling can kind of still hit you after watching this movie today. To me, Lethal Weapon is the best buddy cop movie ever to hit the silver screen. The movie was well received by critics, by audiences, it made a good amount of money. Thus, a sequel was inevitable, and when Lethal Weapon 2 would drop into theaters in 1989, it would prove to be a follow-up film that built off the success of the first while growing the friendship between its main characters and building a clever plot and ramping up the action, essentially writing the great sequel playbook along the way. I really think Lethal Weapon 2 was able to flip the notions of a sequel. This one repeats essentially everything that worked in the first movie, but at the same time is able to kind of do its own new thing. This movie spends much more time developing the friendship between Murtaugh and Riggs, but is still able to weave these character dynamics into tried and true criminal plotting that just serves up ample opportunities for high energy, practical action. Lethal Weapon 2 was really able to just pick up that same atmosphere of the original, and despite it feeling like a wash and repeat plot, it's an interesting and engaging plot as Riggs and Murtaugh battle a villain with diplomatic immunity, plus it adds the comical character of Leo Getz, played perfectly by Joe Pesci, who's able to just come in with Gibson and Glover to make for a charming trio. Lethal Weapon 2 knows that if it isn't broke, don't fix it, and it rides once again on the genuine chemistry between Gibson and Glover to make it a very worthy sequel. Now, The Living Daylights is like the 15th James Bond movie, but it's the first that would feature Timothy Dalton in the leading role. It was another entertaining entry in the franchise, and 2 years later, in 1989, Dalton would return for a sequel that I think was better than his coming out party in the delightfully eccentric and gusto-filled License to Kill, a sequel that stands on its own as a fun, slightly campy espionage action adventure with a perfect touch of grittiness. I'm not sure if this was the first Bond movie I ever watched, but it was definitely the Bond movie I remember watching countless times as a kid. License to Kill is just filled with killer stunt work, resulting in a ton of visually appealing action sequences. Then you get the suave charm of Dalton as Bond, who I really liked. Then you get Robert Davi just playing up a great villain. To me, License to Kill is a fantastic blend of 80s action and 007. It's a bit silly at times. There's a campy eccentricity to this movie as well, and it actually gets pretty violent. You have a villain who feeds his enemies to sharks. Del Toro gets shredded in a brick grinder, and when the violence hits, it's kind of comically over the top. The dialogue is filled with amusing bravado and memorable lines and comical self-seriousness, and when all is said and done, License to Kill, despite its flaws, is a fantastic sequel with action that still looks awesome and a James Bond that was just riding at peak virility. While it did have a lot of action, 1982's First Blood, to me at least, plays much more like a psychological thriller with a heaviness to all the emotion. All of that substance would be thrown out the window when Stallone would reprise his role in 1985's Rambo: First Blood Part 2, resulting in what would become a quintessential 80s action flick, a sequel that would deliver excess at every level, propel the character of Rambo into an 80s icon, and just rake in cash at the summer box office. I definitely remember seeing Rambo 2 as a kid before I watched First Blood. I think I even remember seeing Rambo 3 a few times before as well. I loved Rambo as a kid. I watched the cartoons. I had my own adventures out in the woods behind my house. I had the action figures, my own survival knife, and I could not get enough of this movie. It's far more superficial than First Blood, but its excessive, ultra-explosive action is what makes Rambo 2 a textbook 80s action movie. It's a quintessential one-man army movie. Stallone is absolutely jacked and at peak badass, just taking dudes out in a variety of ways, from stealthy missions to shootouts to awesome close-quarter takedowns and endless explosions. Rambo 2 knows to survive a war, you need to become war, and it tops it off with a helicopter showdown as the cherry on the sundae, making it a sequel that took a small concept and turned it into a larger-than-life action franchise and one of the most iconic franchises from the 80s. And that's it for this video today, guys. These are 10 movies I consider to be great sequels to already classic 80s movies that are still a great time to sit back and watch here in good old 2025. Thank you guys so much for watching. As always, I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. Let me know what some of your picks are for some great sequels or some sequels that were better than their first films. I'd love to hear your guys' picks on those. Again, thank you guys all so much for all your viewership. You guys make this so much fun. Be on the lookout for my next video coming real soon. And until then, movies never say die.
This is Jack Burton in the Pork Chop Express, and I'm talking to whoever's listening out there.
Live a war. You gotta become war.
I suppose we have to register you as a lethal weapon.
You trying to say Jesus Christ can't hit a curveball?